In the first video lecture on Plato's Theaetetus, we saw that the topic of discussion is the question of knowledge. We then saw that Theaetetus had put forward a preliminary definition, which is examples of knowledge. So carpentry, geometry, things like that that were shown to be problematic because they don't tell us the essence of knowledge, only parts of knowledge. So then Theaetetus puts forward the first definition of knowledge, which is that knowledge is perception. We saw that to articulate this definition, Protagoras was used for his epistemological relativism, right? That the human being is the measure of all things. And then Heraclitus was used for the metaphysics of flux to justify why it is then that human beings are the measure of all things. We saw the way in which that was incoherent, did not justify that knowledge is perception. And now, before we get to the second definition of knowledge, Socrates, Theaetetus, and Theodorus continue on trying to make a bit more sense of perception and the role that perception would play in answering that question, what is knowledge? Now, we'll see that actually what they end up arguing here is very important, and it really helps us understand what would be required for understanding what knowledge is, and perhaps how to go about it, but we'll see whether or not they actually end up following that. So they first ask this question, right? So they say, human beings see with eyes, right, and they hear with ears, but is it the eyes with which we see, or is it the eyes through which we see, and so on with the ears and all the other senses, right? The tongue to taste, skin to feel, and so on. Well, it's very apparent that all the information we take in when we look out and I see a snowstorm outside, that I am seeing snow, and I can say, I know that is snow. It is not my eyes which simply tell me that is snow, but it is through the eyes with which I am able to say, I know that is snow. That's a very big difference because it means what is able to articulate that which we know is not the senses. So then Socrates asks, is what we see the same thing as what we hear? Right? If I look outside and I see the snow, I might be able to hear a little bit of a crackling if some of the snow is melting upon landing, depending if there's salt there or perhaps it's a little too warm, so the snow is not making this perfect way in which it sticks. That sensation which occurs through my ears and then through my eyes, are they the exact same sensations? And the answer is no, they are different. That means then, if we were to say that knowledge is perception, that it is simply perception, that to know something is to perceive it, well, we would be then knowing two different things about that one thing, which is snow. So that would complicate the fact that simply perceiving something, right, again, gives us this relativized way in which then we would come to know the thing. And we already saw the argument about why knowledge cannot be relative. It has to be objective. It has to be of the true. So when we then perceive, whether through sight or sound, the snow outside, through what do we think these things about? Through what then do we come up with this concept in which we can articulate that is snow? Is it the eyes which we think this through? Is it the ears? No, it is the soul, as Socrates says. The soul is what perceives, or as they say, grasps these things. And that's a very important word we'll see later when we try to make sense of the second definition. As Socrates says, it seems to me that it's the being of these as well that it looks to, that the soul looks to, that it grasps. objects, the being of snow, the being of a human being, the being of Socrates, the being of a cat, or whatever else. And he says, right, it's the being of these as well that it looks to, especially in their relations to one another, gathering up in itself the past and present things in relation to the future ones. Now, this means that the soul, and it's a little complicated to make sense of what exactly they mean by the soul here. We could read the Phaedrus, or we could read the Phaedo to get a little better sense of what exactly Plato means here by the soul. You could read Aristotle on the soul, or De Anima, and it's going to be a little bit different of an argument. But in one way, you can liken it to the mind, but not the mind in a materialist sense that is simply the brain, but it is that which is able to grasp metaphysical things and not simply physical things. So it's a little complicated just to make sense of it in just the setting. But the takeaway is that it is the soul which is the judge of the true. It is not simply the senses, right? The senses are a means. So the soul is that judge which goes over each perception, comparing them to one another, and then making sense, right? Judging then what is perceived as to what it is. Socrates says, therefore, knowledge is not present in the experiences, right, as Protagoras would have had it, but in the process of gathering what's involved in them. For in the latter, in this process of gathering what's involved in the experiences, as it seems, there is a power to come in touch with being and truth. But in the former, there is no power. In simply the experiences, this power is lacking. This is very important because it means then to understand what knowledge is and answering that question of which this text revolves around. We would need to understand what it means to learn. Now, they continue on saying that it's impossible to have knowledge. It's impossible then to grasp the truth of things of which knowledge is about without grasping then, right, the being, the essence, not simply its existence, that it exists in the world in a perhaps physical sense or causal sense, but literally what makes it what it is. As Socrates says, nevertheless, we've made this much progress at least, that we won't look for it in perception at all, or a better way of understanding, we won't look at it simply in perception, right? Because perception can be involved in the process of learning and gathering knowledge, but in the name, whatever it is that the soul has when it occupies itself by itself alone with beings. Now this then leads Theaetetus to propose the second definition of knowledge. Theaetetus says, well, that, right, this process, at any rate, what it brings about, Socrates, as I suppose, is called having opinion, right? This process of separating out one thing from another and categorizing it then, Theaetetus says, is having opinion. Socrates says, since there is a pair of forms of opinion, right, one truthful and the other false, he asks Theaetetus, do you define knowledge as true opinion? And Theaetetus says, I do, for this in turn now appears to me. Right? So the claim now is that knowledge is only either true opinion or false opinion. That knowledge is either wholly present or absent. Something interesting is there's a turn that just occurred in the development of this dialogue. They had just been describing the process of learning to coming to know as a process of the soul gathering up things and separating them out, right? So notice that's a process. Instead, now, they turn to a static concept of simply true opinion, something definite. That is going to lead them ultimately to an impasse at the end of this text. And it's going to be perhaps, we don't know, because there was no other text that explicitly took up then that topic they had previously discussed about learning, except of course in, say the Republic with the allegory of the cave. It doesn't occur explicitly like that anywhere else. So this ultimately, again, will lead them to an impasse, but that does not mean we don't learn anything about what might be. So we'll learn, of course, what is not knowledge. But we will also learn the likely path of what would be required then for that answer to the question, what is knowledge, to be given. Now they go about trying to make sense of this second definition, that knowledge is true opinion, by considering different ways of making sense that are now known as different puzzles. The first puzzle put forth is known as the puzzle of misidentification. So this says that, because what they want to do is, if you remember in the first video lecture, Protagoras had that claim that no one ever errs in their judgment, right? No one can ever have a false opinion, although some people can be more right than others. So if Socrates and Theaetetus are to explain why knowledge is true opinion, they need to explain then why it is people can have a false opinion. How does that occur? They say, well, maybe false opinion results from judging falsely that for two objects, let's say X and Y, that X is Y, or for an apple and a banana, that the apple is a banana. Now, the interesting thing is, if I truly do know X, if I truly do know the apple, I couldn't possibly mistake it for another, because the soul should have grasped this thing, and it is with the soul of which I am articulating this thought. Now, they do admit that it is perfectly possible for someone who knows, for example, Socrates, to see Theaetetus, and of course think that Theaetetus is Socrates, right? We do this all the time. We might think we see someone we know in a crowd, say at a mall, maybe actually, especially in a, during the COVID pandemic, because people wear masks, it's a little bit more difficult to make out who is who, right? So we do know that actually people we do know, like Socrates or Theaetetus, do mistake other people. And yet we just said that false opinion would mean that if I truly know Socrates, for example, I could not possibly mistake Socrates for someone else. And it would be ridiculous to say if I mistook someone in a crowd for my mom, that, well, then I really don't know my mom, right? That would be absurd. So why should our knowledge about X and Y guarantee us mistakes about X and Y, right? This potential answer here, in this known as the puzzle of misidentification, it can't explain this answer. So instead what they do is, instead of going about the process then of misjudging, they consider what's known as the second puzzle, opinion of what is not, so that which has no essence. So we must consider whether the soul or the mind of the individual has grasped the being of the object as it truly is. So what does this mean? Let's read here from 188b to 188c. Socrates says, well then, does he consider things that he doesn't know to be some other things among those he doesn't know, so that it's possible for someone who knows neither Theaetetus nor Socrates to get it into his thinking that Socrates is Theaetetus or Theaetetus is Socrates, right? And Theaetetus says, well, how could that be? And Socrates says, but surely it's not that someone supposes things he knows to be things he doesn't know. Or, in turn, that what he doesn't know is what he knows, right? That would be a monstrosity. So how then is he still going to have false opinions? For outside these cases, there's presumably no power to have opinions, seeing as how for everything we either know it or don't know it. And in these cases, it appears there's nowhere that's in one's power to have false opinions. Right? To make sense of this, we can ask, can one have an opinion of something that is not? Now, what does that mean? It would mean someone would need to experience and then, right, grasp that with their soul and judge it to be false. Not simply to be false, but to judge the being of falsity. You would have to experience the being of falsity. And so Socrates says, someone who sees at least any one of these things, though, sees something that is. For me to see a table, I must be seeing a table which has an essence which makes it a table. Otherwise, it would not be a table, and I could not articulate anything what I am seeing. Now, the problem is someone who has an opinion of something that is not has an opinion of nothing then. How could this opinion form? Right? To form an opinion, again, we must grasp the being of X. Could I ever form an opinion of a table if I had never grasped the being of tables? How could I ever know what a table is to talk about tables if I had never experienced tables? So Socrates says, it's not possible to have an opinion about something that is not, either in connection with the beings or by itself. Therefore, having false opinions must be something different than having opinions of things that are not. So this is very important. It means that whatever it means to have a false opinion means we do still in some way have a connection with the essence of that thing. So once we've shored this up, this leads them to the third puzzle that's known as inadvertency. So this is where a false opinion occurs because there must be some kind of a mixing up of beings that one knows, right? Perhaps a stool and like a nightstand, or maybe we could say a better example, a couch and an armchair, right? So false opinion must be a mixing up of beings one knows, say a couch and an armchair, having correctly experienced the objects, but the problem is that we just confuse one for the other. And so they say, for in this way, he always has an opinion about something that is, right? So we avoid the problem of the second puzzle. But one thing gets put in place of a different one, and by missing the target he was aiming at, he could justly be described as having false opinions. So all that simply, the problem that occurs is I simply mistake one thing that I do know, right, for just something else. Now, they try to make sense of how would this actually occur? What does it mean then to have this mixing up of beings or things one knows? Okay, all right, so reading from 189e, Socrates says, right, what are we calling this process? He says, speech that the soul itself goes through with itself about whatever it considers. So a kind of inner monologue, think of it this way, then articulating and categorizing those beings with which we are experiencing. He continues, of course, it's as one who doesn't know that I'm declaring it to you. For it has this look to me, that when it's thinking, the soul is doing nothing other than conversing, asking itself questions and answering them itself, and affirming and denying. But whenever it has made a determination, whether more slowly or with a quicker leap, and it asserts the same thing from that point on, and is not divided, we set that down as its opinion. So I at least call forming opinion talking, and opinion a statement that's been made, though not to anyone else or with sound, but in silence to oneself. So we form an opinion then through this process of the soul, right? Taking in and grasping the being of these things and sorting them, right? The experience of the objects according to their essence. So then we know what they are. And then when we want to judge something, we simply just mistake one thing for the wrong essence, right, of what it is. Now, of course, this is not without its own problem, just like the other two puzzles we looked at, right? So let's ask this. If one knows the concept of good, how could they mistake something bad for something good? This simple question, this potential solution of inadvertency, simply collapses back into the first proposal of misidentification. Because, again, if I had truly grasped the being of this thing, if the soul had grasped it, judged it correctly, and therefore, right, to form a true opinion of the thing, I would never have mistaken, for example, something bad for something good in the first place. So this third puzzle cannot explain how it is one has a false opinion. Now, the fourth puzzle is really interesting. It's fun to consider. It's known as the wax analogy, right? So you imagine that the soul is like a blob of wax. Now, for some people, right, their waxes can be bigger, some they can be smaller, some their wax is more pure, some their wax is filthier, some their wax is harder, some more flexible, while some are in a measured condition. So a condition that's, kind of like, think of Goldilocks, right? Not too hot, not too cold, just right. And now what they're doing with this wax analogy then is trying to explain the process of the soul coming to grasp the beings of things. That, again, how it is the soul comes to know when I see that table, that is a table. And I know it because I know what the essence of a table is. And I am perceiving it because the soul is judging it correctly, having grasped and then therefore being able to articulate to itself the soul or the essence of what that table is. Now, the wax then is going to explain, imagine, as we perceive things, right? The images coming into our minds, into our soul, and leaving imprints. So this blob of wax then contains our perceptions, our thoughts, and so on by pressing them into it, right? And of course, the better the mold, the better it is remembered, and therefore the more accurate the representation of that which is being perceived is. So of course, the more measured wax, the one that's more pure, is going to be able to have a better imprint on it than a wax that's not very good, right? And so this actually does take into account then the ethics of then developing oneself, right? Developing the soul of a person such that they're not too maybe not too impatient, right? They might have the right virtues that then predispose them to grasping the beings of things better than other people who maybe don't take care of themselves. So let's read here how Socrates then further explains the wax analogy from 194c. Okay. So, Socrates says, "You'll say it's still more once you've heard the following things. For having true opinions is a beautiful thing, and being wrong is an ugly thing." And so Theaetetus asks, well, yeah, how could it be otherwise? So Socrates explains, well, they say these things come about from this. Whenever the wax in someone's soul is deep, plentiful, smooth, and softened up in a measured way, the things that come through the perceptions, pressing their seals into this heart of the soul, as Homer calls it, making a cryptic allusion to wax. Then, and in these people, the imprints that come to be present are pure and have sufficient depth to be long-lasting. And such people are quick to learn in the first place, and then are good at remembering, so that they don't get the imprints of their perceptions mixed up, but do, therefore, have true opinions. For since the molds are distinct and in a roomy place, these people quickly sort out, each into its own mold, the things that are called beings, and so it's they who are called wise. Or Doesn't it seem that way to you, right? And Theaetetus agrees. Then whenever anyone's heart is shaggy, which the poet wise in all things approves of, or whenever it's mucked up and not made of pure wax, or it's too fluid or too hard, those in whom it's fluid are quick to learn but become forgetful. And those in whom it's hard are the opposite. But the ones who have a shaggy and rough heart that's in any way gravelly filled with dirt or manure that's mixed into it, have their molds indistinct. As those with hard hearts also have indistinct molds, since there's no depth in them. And they're indistinct as well for those with fluid hearts, since they become blurred as a result of running together quickly. And if, in addition to all these things, they've landed on top of one another from a lack of room, in case someone has a little mini soul, they're still more indistinct than those. All these then become the sort of people who have false opinions. For whenever they see or hear or think anything, since they don't have the power to sort each of them out quickly to each mold, they are slow. And by sorting things into the wrong places, they missee and mishear and mistake those things in their thinking. And these in turn are said to be in the wrong about the beings to be without understanding. So we can imagine then, right? Take one wax that's a little too watery, shall we say, right? So it's runny. And you can imagine if you take a statue, right, and you press it into it, if it's too runny, you're not going to get all, right, of the definition that exactly matches that of the statue. Imagine you also have one that maybe has like dirt in it. Well, that dirt is also going to distort, of course, the representation of that statue. So only a perfect wax, carefully, right, measured and then carefully impressed with the statue is going to give one an accurate representation then of that which one is perceiving, and therefore allows one to then know what it is. Now there is again an allusion here to education because of course, right, as Socrates says, the unexamined life is not worth living. In a way, Socrates is trying to explain here with this wax analogy, well, to come to know things, one's soul must be in a measured condition, meaning they are critical in their beliefs. They are not too quick to judgment. They're not slothful, right? They take carefully the judgments of others. They take carefully the judgments of the things about the world and around them, and therefore what forms their beliefs, right? This is the only way one can then become wise. Now, there are three cases then that we know false opinion can't occur in this pure thought, right, of this inner monologue of the soul to itself, according to the wax analogy. Now, what we get out of this is that first, if Socrates is familiar with Theodorus, for example, in Theaetetus, but Socrates doesn't see either of them, right? And no other perception about them is present to them either. So Socrates doesn't see out in the distance Theodorus or Theaetetus, and Socrates is not seeing pictures of Theodorus or Theaetetus. Socrates could not at that time have in theirself the opinion that Theaetetus is Theodorus, because there's no incoming perception to confuse with the essence of Theodorus and Theaetetus. Another case for false opinion, therefore, cannot occur, is where Socrates could be familiar, let's say, with Theodorus and not Theaetetus, right? And perceiving, again, neither of them, in both either way in real life or in a representation like a picture, again, at that time, Socrates could not suppose that Theaetetus is Theodorus because Socrates doesn't know Theaetetus and so could not have this opinion of Theaetetus to then confuse with Theodorus. And finally, if Socrates was not familiar with either Theodorus or Theaetetus and was not perceiving either of these people, Socrates could not suppose that he knows, one of them and can therefore mistake the two of them. Now, hopefully you noticed this is going back to what brought up this whole conversation of the question of knowledge. When Socrates was conversing with Theodorus, off in the distance, Theaetetus is approaching, and Theodorus says, Socrates, you have to meet Theaetetus. He looks just like you, right? So that was not just a random occasion which just was brought up. I hope you notice in these dialogues, right, all these things that might seem irrelevant end up coming back and play an important role in some way or another in these dialogues. There's almost seemingly not a single word, right, that is unimportant. Now, this might seem to make sense about these three cases where we cannot have then a false opinion. But like the other three puzzles, there is still a problem as well with the wax analogy. The wax analogy argues again that false opinions cannot occur. Such mistakes would be confusions of two objects of thought, and the wax analogy does not dispute the earlier finding that there can be no such confusions, right? So the problem of the first puzzle and the problem of the third puzzle, which collapsed back into the first puzzle, that, again, if the soul has truly grasped the being of something, so therefore it would truly know it, it could never mistake it, because only mistaking, therefore, would mean that it did not know it, because it would make a false judgment, a false opinion of that thing. And if knowledge is true opinion, then one would have never known it in the first place. So even according to the wax analogy, false opinion is not possible. We get a fifth and final puzzle offered to make sense of this claim that knowledge is true opinion. This is known as the aviary. This solution attempts to solve the problem of false opinion, right, how false opinion is possible, by enacting a distinction between knowledge someone merely has, which we could think of as latent knowledge, and knowledge that one is actually using, so active knowledge. Having these two concepts of knowledge, then, latent knowledge and active knowledge, false opinion is said to occur when someone wants to use some item of latent knowledge, right? So think of the knowledge in storage they're not actively thinking about, right? So they want to use some of that in their active thought, so some activity maybe they're doing, some judgment, some thinking, but they end up making a wrong selection from among the items that they know latently. Now, this is a long passage I'm going to read, but I really do want to try and get as close to the dialogue here as possible and the nuances involved in explaining this puzzle of the aviary. So, reading from 197d. Socrates says, "So again, just as in the preceding discussion, we made up some sort of wax contrivance in our souls." I don't know what. Now, again, let's make some, right, so there's a little bit of play on the topic of discussion, of course, right? What is knowledge? They don't know what knowledge is. So how could they even know what it is they were talking about with this wax analogy? But he says, now again, let's make some sort of pigeon coop in each soul for all sorts of birds, some in flocks apart from the rest, others in small bunches, and some alone, flying through them all however they happen to. Now, one ought to claim that when we are children, this container is empty. So there is a little bit here of a using up part of that discussion about the process of learning before they got to the second definition that's involved right here. Right, so all through this, you should be noticing the dialectic that is occurring here, right? And this process of going down one path, coming to an impasse, but still taking up part of it, right? It's not useless, everything that was discussed, and using that then going down another path, and so on and so forth, kind of like branches shooting out from a tree. So one ought to claim that when we're children, this container, right, of this pigeon coop, right, in our souls is empty, and to think of pieces of knowledge instead of birds. And whatever piece of knowledge anyone confines in this enclosure, when he's acquired it, one ought to say he has learned or discovered the things that this was the knowledge of, and so that this is knowing. Then, as for hunting down again whichever piece of knowledge one wants, and holding it when one has grabbed it, and letting it go again, consider what names are needed, whether they are the same as when one first acquired them or different. And you'll understand what I mean more clearly from this, right? He asks Theaetetus, you speak of an art of arithmetic, right? So he's going to try and relate to something that Theaetetus already understands because he's kind of a prodigy in mathematics. So Socrates says, then conceive of that as a hunting for pieces of knowledge about everything that's even or odd. So imagine the pigeon coop in the soul, right? And you have the different birds and you hunt for them and then you capture them and put them in the cage. Imagine instead of birds, it's really knowledge we're after. And that really there are these two kinds of knowledge, right? And we have even and odd kinds of knowledge, right? Which we'll see be true and false kinds of knowledge. Socrates says, now it's by this art, I suppose, that he keeps at hand the pieces of knowledge about numbers, and also by it that one who hands them over to someone else hands them over. And we speak of the one who hands them over as teaching, and the one who takes them to himself as learning, and hence of the one who has them by possessing them in that pigeon coop as knowing. Now turn your attention to what follows directly from this. When someone is completely skilled at arithmetic, does that mean anything else than that he knows all numbers? For the pieces of knowledge about all numbers belong to him in his soul. So we'll set it down that the counting is nothing other than examining how big any number happens to be, right? And then therefore whether it is an even or an odd number. Therefore, the one whom we've agreed knows all number, when he's examining, shows himself as not knowing the thing he knows. You presumably hear that disputes of this sort. Then, since we're making an image of the possession and hunting of pigeons, we'll say that the hunting was twofold. One of them before acquiring for the sake of possessing, the other by the possessor for the sake of grabbing and holding in his hands what he has possessed for some time. So too about those things of which there were pieces of knowledge belonging for some time to someone who has learned them and has known them, there is such a thing as thoroughly understanding these same things again by taking back up and holding the knowledge of each thing that he'd possessed for some time, but didn't have at hand in his thinking. This is exactly, Socrates says, what I was asking just now. How ought one to use the names to speak about them when someone skilled at arithmetic enters upon counting, or a literate person enters upon reading, since, therefore, in such a case, though he knows, he's going back for the purpose of learning from himself what he knows, right? So in a way, he's trying to explain the process of remembering, because we might come to know something through the process of learning, right? So let's say you learn how to do long division, right, in grade school. Now, you might know how to do it, but you haven't done it for years, right? And then, for some reason, you have to do long division. In this case, you would want to try and remember, right, what is that latent knowledge, right, and turn it then into active knowledge, one that you would be using, right? It's some means to an end. So Socrates asks, but are we to say he's going to read or to count things that he doesn't know, though we've granted to him that he knows all letters or all numbers, right? As if he's having to go back and, by remembering, relearn that which we already said he knows. Theaetetus says, yeah, that's senseless. That doesn't seem to make sense. Then do you want us to say that none of the names is of any concern to us, in whichever way anyone enjoys dragging around, the word or concept knowing and learning, but since we've determined that it's one thing to possess knowledge but another thing to have it, we claim that it's impossible for someone not to possess what he's acquired, so that no one ever turns out not to know what he knows, though it is possible to take up a false opinion about it. For it is possible not to have the knowledge of it, but some other in its place. Whenever in hunting for some piece of knowledge somewhere at some time, while they're fluttering around, mistaking it, he takes up one in place of another. Therefore, at such a time, he supposes 12 to be 11, taking up the knowledge of 11 that's in himself in place of that of 12, as if it were a ring-necked dove instead of a pigeon, right? So in the case of searching for, imagine the cage of birds, which are really just, different knowledge we have. That latent knowledge, seeking it to be active knowledge, we reach in the cage and we accidentally mistake, right, the dove for a pigeon. Since, of course, it wouldn't make sense to simply say we have to relearn something if we already knew it. Now, Theaetetus says that has sense to it. We'll see. So Socrates continues, then whenever one takes up what he puts his hand out to take up, at such a time he is without falsity and has the things that are as opinions. And so in this way there is both true and false opinion, and none of the things we were inconvenienced by in the previous discussion becomes an obstacle. Socrates says, in fact, we've gotten rid of the not knowing the things people know, since it no longer turns out anywhere that we don't possess what we possess, either when we are wrong about anything or when we are not. However, another misfortune, a more terrible one, seems to be revealing itself. He says, if the interchange of pieces of knowledge is ever going to become a false opinion, this is what seems to be revealing itself, this troubling aspect of this fifth puzzle, the aviary. He says, in the first place, for someone who has knowledge of anything to be ignorant of that very thing, not by means of ignorance, but by means of his own knowledge, and next, to have the opinion that this is something else, and something else in turn is this, how is that not a load of nonsense? When, with knowledge present, the soul recognizes nothing and is ignorant of everything. On the basis of this account, nothing prevents ignorance, when it's present, from making one know something, or blindness from making one see, if indeed knowledge is ever going to make someone be ignorant of anything. So Theaetetus says, then perhaps, Socrates, we didn't set up the birds in a beautiful way, when we only set them down as pieces of knowledge, and it was necessary also to put in pieces of non-knowledge flying around together with them in the soul, and for the hunter sometimes to take hold of a piece of knowledge and sometimes of a piece of non-knowledge about the same thing, having a false opinion with the non-knowledge and a true one with the knowledge, such that, therefore, it is non-knowledge, right, things we don't know when we have the false opinion, and we grasp things then that we do know when we have a true opinion of them, which is why we can then have that true opinion, make a judgment of things. Socrates says, though, let's take a good look at what you're saying, Theaetetus. For let it be as you say. The one who takes hold of a piece of non-knowledge will, you claim, have a false opinion, won't he? But presumably he's not going to think he has a false opinion, but a true one. And his attitude will be that of someone who knows the things about which he is wrong. Therefore, he'll suppose he has knowledge when he's hunted for it and not non-knowledge. So this leads Socrates to say, sadly, then after we've gone a long way around, we are back at our first impasse. We have fallen back to that first puzzle. For that skilled refuter will laugh and say, best of fellows, will someone who knows both a piece of knowledge and a piece of non-knowledge suppose that one of them, which he knows, is some other thing that he knows? Or knowing neither of them, does he have the opinion that what he doesn't know is something else that he doesn't know? Or knowing one of them, but not the other, will he think what he knows is what he doesn't know, or what he doesn't know is what he knows? Or will you tell me next that there are also pieces of knowledge about the pieces of knowledge and non-knowledge, which the one possessing them has enclosed in some other ridiculous pigeon coops or wax contrivances, and knows for as long as he possesses them, even if he doesn't have them at hand in his soul. And in that way, will you force yourselves to run back around to the same place thousands of times, making no headway? So Socrates asks, what will we answer to these things, Theaetetus? Theaetetus says, I don't know what we ought to say. Then, my boy, doesn't the argument give us a beautiful rebuke and point out that it was not correct for us to look for false opinion before knowledge, leaving that alone? But the former is something one has no power to recognize before one gets a sufficient grasp of what knowledge is. Now, what just happened is they realized, well, it doesn't make sense to say that they're, imagine two different kinds of birds, right? The non-knowledge and the knowledge, and we accidentally grasp the non-knowledge, mistaking it for knowledge, because then we would have to know that that is non-knowledge, which means we would still have to then know what that thing is, and we would have to mistake one for the other, which leads us back to the problem of the first puzzle. If we truly know something, we would never mistake it for something else. Further, though, right, they ask the question, well, we've just been inquiring into how to make sense of the possibility of having a false opinion. Now, if that were successful, what they were just doing, trying to explain how it is that one can form a false opinion, wouldn't they have to know what a false opinion is? And to know what a false opinion is, wouldn't they have to know what it means to have knowledge? So how could they explain what a false opinion is before they know what a true opinion is? Or, more bluntly, how could they know what non-knowledge is before knowing what knowledge is? Now we get to this final refutation of this second definition of knowledge, that it is true opinion, with this example in a courtroom. So imagine this, right? You have a courtroom set up where you have a lawyer that is trying to persuade a jury that X person, right, that's up on trial, is or is not guilty. Right? So ask yourself this. Does that mean then that the lawyer would have knowledge of the crime or the innocence necessarily? Maybe not, right? We know this happens in practice. The lawyer might not actually know all the information. Or sometimes, right, what is the lawyer trying to do? Simply persuade, even if it is a wrong thing. So we're led to this question. Well, does it matter that the jury then are secondhand to the perception of the crime? Because the jury would not have witnessed the crime or potential crime, right? But we'll just suppose the person is guilty. Does it matter that the jury did not actually witness the crime itself to know whether or not that person up there is guilty or not? So what if X person, right, on trial is guilty, and the lawyer successfully persuades the jury that X person is guilty? So it turns out it is true that the person on trial is guilty, and now the jury believe X person is guilty. So they have formed this opinion. They now possess an opinion of the guilt of the person on trial, and it turns out the person on trial is guilty. So they would then therefore have a true opinion. Their opinion is true. Does this mean, though, they possess knowledge? Now, further, what if then a witness happens to form an opinion that X person is guilty, right? Again, X person is guilty, but that witness, or even potentially the jury, cannot explain, they can't articulate why X person is guilty. They can only just simply say that they are convinced that they are, right? And they're correct to be convinced because their opinion is true, and yet they cannot tell you why. They can't articulate it. Would this mean that they really have knowledge? The answer is no, because that means, right, remember the soul is supposed to have this inner monologue, this process of articulation, of sorting out the being of things, right? The true from the false. If the person cannot articulate, right, they cannot give justification for their opinion, even if their opinion is true, then they don't have knowledge because they can't justify it. They cannot articulate the process by which then their opinion is true, how they know it. This simply means knowledge by itself is not true opinion. As Socrates says, then whenever the jurors are justly persuaded about things, it's possible to know only by seeing them and in no other way, at a time when they are deciding these things from hearing about them and getting hold of a true opinion. Haven't they decided without knowledge, even though if they judged well, they were persuaded of correct things? So we now know it is possible to possess a true opinion and yet still not possess knowledge.